They say Willow Lane is where the perfect people go to sleep. But some of us are just better at dreaming with our eyes open.
The voice that emerged from the silhouette was not a stranger's voice, nor was it the voice of a monster, for monsters do not speak with the tired, gravelly cadence of a man who has spent 30 years passing judgment on the sins of others. It was Judge Marcus Thorne.
He stood there in the doorway with his raincoat dripping onto the concrete floor, his heavy flashlight lowered now so that the beam pooled harmlessly against his boots, illuminating the mud and the dead leaves he had tracked in from the storm outside. He did not look at the phone that was still ringing in Julian's hand, nor did he look at the terrified faces of his neighbors huddled in the dark of the basement. He looked past them, toward the wall where the thick black wire disappeared into the masonry, and he spoke with a terrifying calm that seemed to absorb the mechanical shrieking of the telephone.
"Answer it, Julian," the judge said, his voice rolling through the damp air like distant thunder. "She knows we are here." Julian Vane, a man who built his fortune on invisible currencies and encrypted secrets, looked down at the plastic receiver as if it were a live serpent uncoiling in his palm. The ringing stopped, replaced by a silence that was heavier than the noise had been, a silence that pressed against the eardrums and made the blood roar in their heads. He lifted the device to his ear, his hand trembling just enough to make the cord sway, and he said nothing, waiting for the void on the other end to speak first. There was no scream, no distorted electronic threat, no heavy breathing of a predator lying in wait. There was only the sound of a teaspoon clinking against china. "Bring them home, Marcus," a woman's voice said, tinny and small through the speaker, leaking out into the cold room so that everyone could hear it. "The tea is steeping, and I have unlocked the back door." The line went dead with a soft, final click. Julian lowered the phone, his face pale in the reflected glow of the flashlight, and he looked at the judge, then at Sarah, then at Silas, his eyes wide with a confusion that was rapidly curdling into dread. They all knew that voice.
It was not a voice from a nightmare. It was the voice that had greeted them at the annual block party for a decade, the voice that reminded them about recycling pickup dates, the voice that organized the holiday decoration committee. It was Martha Higgins.
The judge turned slowly, the heavy rubber of his soul squeaking on the cement, and he gestured with the flashlight back the way he had come, back toward the stairs that led up to the rain-slicked reality of Willow Lane. "We have been looking in the wrong direction," the judge said, and he began to walk.
The ascent from the basement was a procession of gusts, a slow and mournful climb where each step felt like a concession to a truth they did not yet understand. They emerged into the night air, which smelled of ozone and wet asphalt, and they found themselves standing in the empty lot where the dinner table still sat, the candles burned down to nubs now, flickering desperately against the encroaching wind. The wire they had followed, the wire that had led them on this loop of paranoia, ran from the basement, snake-like through the tall grass, and disappeared under the street, surfacing again on the other side. It ran directly to house number 2. Martha Higgins's house stood like a fortress of solitude at the top of the gentle slope, its windows dark, save for a faint, pulsating blue glow emanating from the kitchen at the rear. It was a pristine structure, a colonial revival with perfectly manicured hedges that now looked like jagged teeth in the moonlight, and the white siding, usually so bright and welcoming, seemed bleached and skeletal, a monument to a meticulous order that had rotted from the inside out. They crossed the street in a phalanx of silence.
Leo Chin held his wife's hand so tightly his knuckles were white, while Evelyn Reed, the retired librarian, clutched her cardigan around her throat as if to protect herself from a draft that came not from the weather but from the house itself. They did not run. To run would be to admit panic, and they were past panic now. settled into a numb, rhythmic march toward the inevitable.
The judge reached the front door first, but he did not knock, nor did he try the handle, for the instructions had been specific. He led them around the side of the house, past the rose bushes that Martha tended with the devotion of a mother, past the garbage cans that were lined up with military precision, to the back door that led into the kitchen. It was ajar.
A sliver of warmth escaped from the gap, carrying with it the scent of lavender and something else, something stale, like old newspapers and dust that has been heated by electronics. Silas Blackwood, the taxidermist, pushed the door open with the toe of his boot.
The kitchen of house number 2 was usually a magazine spread of domestic perfection, with gleaming granite countertops and copper pots hanging from a wrought iron rack. But tonight, the kitchen had been transformed. The island, usually reserved for rolling out cookie dough or arranging flowers, had been cleared of all culinary tools. In their place was a bank of monitors.
There were 6 of them, a mismatched collection of technology, ranging from bulky, humped-back CRT televisions from the 90s to sleek, modern flat screens, all wired together in a chaotic nest of cables that spilled over the edge of the island like black entrails. And in front of this altar of glass and wire sat Martha Higgins. She was sitting in a high-backed wooden chair, her posture rigid, her hands folded primly in her lap.
She was wearing her Sunday best, a floral blouse buttoned to the neck and a gray skirt that fell below her knees, but her hair, usually sprayed into an immovable helmet of silver, was loose and wispy, framing a face that looked hollowed out by exhaustion. She did not turn around when they entered. "Please," she said, her voice soft, barely audible over the low hum of the cooling fans whirring behind the screens. "Close the door."
"You're letting the damp in." Judge Thorne stepped inside, followed by the others, the wet squelch of their shoes on the linoleum sounding obscenely loud in the quiet room. Sarah Miller reached back and pushed the door shut, the latch clicking with the finality of a prison lock. They stood in a semicircle around the island, staring at the screens.
The images were grainy, some black and white, some in high-definition color, but the subjects were unmistakable. On the far left screen, a camera angle from a high shelf looked down into the living room of House 4. It showed Mark Miller pacing back and forth, a drink in his hand, talking on a phone that he thought was secure.
On the center screen, a view from what must have been a hidden lens in a ventilation grate showed the interior of Julian Vane's home office in House 15. It showed him weeping, his head in his hands, surrounded by hard drives that he had been frantically drilling holes into just days before.
On another screen, the camera was focused on the street itself, a wide-angle shot that covered the entirety of Willow Lane, capturing the comings and goings of every car, every delivery truck, every late-night stroller who thought they were walking alone under the stars. But the most disturbing image was on the largest screen in the center. It was a live feed of the empty lot across the street. It showed the dinner table they had just fled.
It showed the empty chairs, the half-eaten food, the wine glasses still stained with red, and the candles guttering out one by one. Martha had watched them leave. She had watched them panic. She had watched them hunt for a villain, all the while sitting here in the dark, sipping tea, waiting for them to realize that the call was coming from the head of the neighborhood watch.
"Why?" The word came from Claire Hastings, the young mother from House 8. Her voice was trembling, tears streaming down her face as she looked at a monitor that showed a view of her own backyard, focusing on the sandbox where her children played. "Why would you do this, Martha? We trusted you." Martha finally turned. Her eyes were dry. There was no malice in them, no maniacal gleam of a mastermind reveling in her triumph.
There was only a profound, crushing sadness, the look of a woman who has carried a weight for so long that she has forgotten what it feels like to stand up straight. Trust. Martha repeated, tasting the word as if it were sour milk. That is a lovely word, Claire, a fragile word. But trust is not a strategy. Trust is not a shield.
Trust is what you say you have when you are too afraid to ask what is really happening behind your neighbor's curtains. She reached out and tapped a key on a dirty keyboard that sat amidst the tangle of wires. The screen showing Mark Miller changed. It rewinded, the timestamp in the corner scrolling back 3 years. "I didn't do this to hurt you," Martha said, looking at Mark. "I did this to save you."
Do you remember the break-ins on Oak Street 5 years ago? Do you remember how terrified we all were? We held a meeting. We said we needed to be vigilant. We said we needed to look out for one another. She gestured to the wall of screens. I simply took that mandate seriously. Julian stepped forward, his anger overcoming his fear. "This isn't looking out for us, Martha. This is sickness. You bugged our homes?"
You put cameras in our vents. Martha smiled, a thin, wintry expression. Oh, Julian, you give me too much credit. I am a 70-year-old widow on a fixed income. I don't know how to hack a computer. I don't know how to install a micro camera in a ventilation shaft. She pointed a trembling finger at the screen showing his office. That feed? That's from the webcam on your own laptop. You left the default password as password.
"You never updated the firmware. I simply logged in." She turned to the Millers. "And the audio from your living room? That's the baby monitor you threw away 3 years ago because the display was cracked. You didn't realize the transmitter was still active, still paired, still broadcasting to anyone with a receiver on the same frequency. I picked it up from the curb on trash day." The room went deadly silent.
The horror that washed over them was not the horror of being hunted by a genius. It was the horror of their own negligence. It was the realization that they had broadcast their lives to the world through sheer laziness, through the assumption that no one was listening, that no one cared enough to listen. "I didn't dig," Martha whispered, leaning forward, her eyes scanning their faces. "I didn't pry. I just collected."
I collected what you threw away. I collected what you left unlocked. The letters you didn't shred. The windows you left open on warm summer nights when voices carry. The digital footprints you left in the mud. She stood up slowly, her joints popping in the quiet room. She walked to the window and looked out at the dark street. I wanted to know who I was living next to, she said. I wanted to be sure that I was safe.
And the more I watched, the more I realized that none of us are safe. Not from the world outside, but from each other. She turned back to them, her expression hardening. You lie, all of you. You lie to your spouses, you lie to your children, you lie to the IRS, you lie to yourselves. Mark, you've been funneling money from your firm into a gambling account for 6 years.
Claire, you aren't taking night classes. You sit in your car in the supermarket parking lot for 3 hours just to get away from your kids. Julian, your crypto empire is a Ponzi scheme that is 2 weeks away from collapsing. The accusations hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I watched, Martha said, her voice rising slightly, the first crack in her composure. I watched and I waited for one of you to be honest, just once. I wanted to see if anyone on the street had the courage to live in the light, but you just kept closing your blinds. You just kept smiling at the block parties and lying through your teeth. So you invited us to dinner, the judge said, his voice low. You set the table in the empty lot. I wanted to force the issue, Martha said, sinking back into her chair. I wanted to strip away the walls. I thought if I made you see.
If I made you feel the pressure of being watched, you might finally confess. You might finally talk to each other. Transparency is safety, isn't it? If we have nothing to hide, we have nothing to fear. She laughed, a dry, rattling sound. But you didn't confess. You panicked. You turned on each other. You ran through the woods like frightened animals. She looked at the screens, at the static and the flickering images of empty rooms.
I failed, she whispered. I tried to purify the neighborhood, and all I did was prove that it was already dead. The silence that followed was absolute. There was nothing to say. The secrets were out, not because she had shouted them, but because she had confirmed that they were known. The anonymity that allowed them to be neighbors, the polite fiction that they were all normal, functional people, had been destroyed.
Julian looked at Sarah, but Sarah looked away. Mark looked at his shoes. Evelyn stared at the ceiling. They could not look at each other. The social contract of Willow Lane had been breached, not by violence, but by truth. Martha reached out to the power strip on the counter. Her hand hovered over the red switch. I'm tired, she said. I'm so very tired of watching. She flipped the switch. One by one, the screens died. The blue glow vanished.
The hum of the fans spun down into nothingness. The kitchen was plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the moonlight filtering through the blinds. In the dark, they were just shadows again. Go home, Martha said from the darkness. Please, just go home. They left the way they had come, filing out of the kitchen, past the garbage cans, down the driveway. They did not speak to Martha. They did not speak to each other. The walk back across the street was a funeral procession. The wind had died down. The air was still and cold. They reached the street, and there the group fractured. Julian turned left toward House 15, walking fast, his head down, already calculating how much time he had before the collapse, how he could pack, where he could run. He would be gone by morning. The Millers turned toward House 4. They walked side by side, but there was a chasm between them now, a distance measured in years of deception that could never be bridged. They would enter their house, and they would sleep in separate rooms, and the silence would eat them alive. Leo and Maya Chen walked to House 10, holding hands, but the grip was loose, tentative, the trust eroded by the knowledge that privacy was an illusion. Judge Thorne stood in the middle of the street for a long moment, watching them go. He looked back at House 2. The kitchen light was off. The house was a tomb. He knew that Martha would be sitting there in the dark, surrounded by blank screens, alone with the burden of knowing everything and changing nothing. He turned and walked to House 1, his footsteps heavy and slow. The street was empty.
In the vacant lot, the dinner table stood like a ruin of a lost civilization. The wind rippled the tablecloth. The wine in the glasses had settled, dark and still as blood. There was one candle left burning. It was a thick pillar of wax, melted down to a puddle, the wick drowning in the liquid. The flame was small, a tiny orange eye blinking in the vast darkness of Willow Lane. It flickered once, twice.
It illuminated the empty chairs, the plates of cold food, the wire that snaked away into the grass. It flickered a third time, struggling against the inevitable, and then, with a wisp of gray smoke that vanished instantly into the night, the flame went out. Darkness reclaimed the lot. Darkness reclaimed the street. Willow Lane was silent.
And in the silence, the houses stood like headstones, and inside them, the people lay in their beds, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, listening to the settling of the floorboards, waiting for the dawn, and wondering, for the first time in their lives, who was listening back.
The darkness that swallowed Willow Lane was not merely an absence of light, but a physical weight, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed down upon the rooftops and seeped through the cracks in the window frames, filling the spaces where trust had once resided with a cold, impenetrable density.
The streetlights, governed by a timer that had long since drifted out of sync with the seasons,
flickered and buzzed with an erratic, dying energy, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the pavement like skeletal fingers grasping for purchase on the asphalt, while the moon, indifferent and distant, offered only a pale, sickly illumination that turned the manicured lawns into gray, colorless expanses of frost and dead grass.
Inside House 15, the silence was not peaceful, but vibrated with the frantic, terrified energy of a trapped animal, for Julian had not simply returned home to sleep, but to dismantle the life he had so carefully constructed over 5 years of meticulous deception.
He moved through his bedroom with a chaotic precision, his movements jerky and disjointed, pulling a suitcase from the top shelf of the closet with a desperation that sent a cascade of dust motes dancing into the stagnant air.
He did not turn on the overhead light, fearing that the illumination would be a signal, a beacon to the watching eyes he now felt burning into the back of his neck. So he packed by the glow of the street lamp filtering through the blinds, the slats casting horizontal bars of shadow across his face, like the bars of a prison cell.
He threw clothes into the open maw of the suitcase without folding them, his hands trembling so violently that he fumbled the zipper of his toiletries bag, the plastic sound of the teeth interlocking, sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room.
He was calculating flight paths, bank transfers, and the liquidity of assets in his head, a mental spreadsheet of survival that fragmented every time he heard the settling of the house's foundation, a sound he had ignored for years, but which now sounded like footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate, and ascending.
He paused, holding a stack of cash he kept hidden inside a hollowed-out book on architecture, and he listened, straining his ears against the ringing silence, waiting for the siren, the knock, or the inevitable ringing of the telephone that would announce the collapse of his world.
Across the street, in the sterile architectural perfection of House 4, the Millers moved through their kitchen like ghosts haunting the same castle, occupying the same physical coordinates but separated by a psychic distance so vast that light itself would take centuries to cross it.
They did not look at each other, for to look would be to acknowledge the stranger standing across the granite island, to admit that the person they had shared a bed with for a decade was a fabrication, a collection of secrets wrapped in skin and clothing.
Sarah Miller stood by the sink, staring into the dark drain, her hand gripping a glass of water so tightly that her knuckles turned the color of old bone, while David sat at the small breakfast table, his head in his hands, staring at the grain of the wood as if trying to decipher a map that would lead him out of this labyrinth.
The refrigerator hummed, a low, monotonous drone that underscored the tension, a mechanical heartbeat for a dead marriage, and when the ice maker cycled, dropping cubes into the bin with a sudden, clattering crash, they both flinched, their nerves frayed to the point of snapping. Yet neither of them spoke, for there were no words left in the English language capable of bridging the chasm that Martha's revelation had blasted open.
They were prisoners of their mortgage, bound to the house and to each other by the invisible chains of shared equity and mutual destruction. And as they eventually moved toward the stairs, climbing to the second floor in a synchronized, silent march, the house felt less like a sanctuary and more like a mausoleum, where they would lie down in separate rooms and wait for the slow, grinding erosion of time to finish what the evening had started.
Further down the block, where the shadows seemed to pool with a greater intensity around the stoop of House 1, Judge Thorne sat in his study, a leather armchair swallowing his formidable frame, a glass of amber liquid resting untouched on the mahogany coaster beside him.
He was a man who had built a career on the parsing of truth, on the careful weighing of evidence, and the delivery of absolute judgments. Yet tonight he sat in the ruins of his own certainty, staring at the wall of law books that lined the room, their spines gilded with gold leaf that caught the stray moonlight and glimmered with a mocking opulence. He realized with a sinking sensation in his gut that felt like the drop of a roller coaster that the law was a fragile, artificial construct, a paper shield that offered no protection against the raw, chaotic truth of human nature that Martha had unleashed upon the lane. He thought of the screens in Martha's kitchen, the blue glow that had illuminated the terrified faces of his neighbors, and he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It was the chill of complicity, the realization that his own desire for order, his own unspoken endorsement of the neighborhood's strict social codes, had created the petri dish in which Martha's paranoia had flourished. He reached for the glass, his hand steady despite the turmoil in his mind, and took a slow sip, the alcohol burning a path down his throat, grounding him in the physical world. But as he set the glass down, he noticed something on his desk that made his breath catch in his throat. A single, plain white envelope, unsealed, resting on the blotter where he was certain it had not been when he left for the dinner party hours ago. He stared at it for a long, agonizing minute, the silence of the house pressing in on his eardrums, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounding like a countdown, until finally, with the resignation of a man walking to the gallows, he reached out and lifted the flap, pulling out a single sheet of paper that contained no words but a photograph, a grainy black and white image taken from a high angle, showing him, Judge Thorne, standing in his own backyard 3 years ago, burying a small, heavy box beneath the roots of the oak tree. The photo was dated and time-stamped, a testament to a surveillance that predated his awareness, a proof that Martha's archives were not just a recent obsession, but a historical record of every transgression, every hidden act, every buried secret that Willow Lane had tried to swallow. The wind outside began to pick up, a low, mournful howl that rattled the window panes and sent a cascade of dry leaves skittering across the pavement, the sound like the whispering of 1,000 dry voices sharing rumors in the dark.
In House 10, Leo and Maya Chen sat on the edge of their bed, still fully clothed, their shoes still on their feet, as if they were passengers in a waiting room anticipating a departure that had been indefinitely delayed.
They held hands, but the grip was clammy and desperate, a lifeline thrown between two drowning swimmers, and they stared at the blank screen of the television mounted on the wall, seeing in its black reflection the distorted images of their own fear. They had believed, naively, that their love was a fortress, a private garden walled off from the world, but they now understood that the walls were made of glass, and that for years, their most intimate moments, their arguments, their reconciliations, their whispers in the dark, had been performance art for an audience of one.
"We have to leave," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind, a fractured sound that broke on the last syllable. "We can't stay here, Leo. Not after this. It's in the walls. It feels like it's in the walls."
Leo nodded slowly, but his eyes did not leave the reflection in the television screen, for he was paralyzed by the logistics of escape, by the terrifying knowledge that to leave was to admit defeat, to run was to validate the surveillance, and he wondered, with a sickening lurch of paranoia, if the camera lenses were truly dark, or if even now, in the privacy of their bedroom, the red tally light was blinking somewhere behind a vent, behind a mirror, recording their fear for a future review.
He squeezed her hand, but he could offer no reassurance, no platitudes about safety, because the word safety had been stripped of its meaning, revealed to be nothing more than a comforting lie we tell ourselves to sleep at night, while the world watches us through the gaps in the curtains. And back at House 2, the epicenter of the earthquake, the eye of the hurricane, Martha Higgins sat alone in the darkness of her kitchen, the silence ringing in her ears like tinnitus. The screens were black, dead squares of glass that reflected nothing but the empty room. Yet the hum of the servers in the basement beneath her feet continued, a low, persistent vibration that traveled up through the floorboards and into the soles of her shoes,
a reminder that the machine she had built was not so easily turned off.
She did not weep. She had moved beyond tears into a state of catatonic shock, her mind looping endlessly over the expressions on their faces, the disgust, the hatred, the pity. And she realized that in her quest to save the neighborhood from the chaos of the outside world, she had become the monster that they feared, the boogeyman that lived not under the bed, but in the wiring of the house itself.
She looked down at her hands, resting on the cool laminate of the counter, and saw that they were trembling, old hands with translucent skin and prominent veins, hands that had baked pies and planted hydrangeas and signed welcome cards, hands that had also spliced wires and adjusted focal lengths and cataloged the sins of her friends. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to smash the screens, to take a hammer to the hard drives, to burn the house down and purify the land with fire. But she remained frozen, held in place by the inertia of her own creation, by the terrible knowledge that even if she destroyed the evidence, she could never destroy the memory of what she had seen, or the knowledge of what they now knew she was.
The clock on the wall ticked past 3 a.m., the witching hour, the time when the soul is most vulnerable and the mind most prone to the phantoms of guilt and regret. Outside, the street was a canyon of shadows. The vacant lot where the dinner party had taken place was now a desolate landscape, the table standing like a shipwreck on a dark ocean, the white tablecloth rippling violently in the increasing wind, snapping like a flag of surrender.
The plates of food, now cold and congealed, sat untouched, a feast for the insects and the rats that would soon emerge from the storm drains to reclaim the territory. The chairs were pushed back at chaotic angles, frozen in the positions of hasty departure, a silent testimony to the flight of the guests.
The wire, the thick black cable that Julian had followed, the umbilical cord that connected the table to Martha's house, still lay in the grass, snaking through the weeds, a physical scar on the landscape that no one had dared to touch or sever. It lay there, inert and heavy, yet it seemed to pulse with a latent energy, a conduit for the poison that had flowed both ways, from the house to the table, and from the table back to the house.
And then, a sound cut through the layering of the wind and the silence. It was not a loud sound, but in the absolute stillness of Willow Lane, it was as jarring as a scream. It came from the vacant lot, from the table. It was a digital chirping, a rhythmic, electronic trill. Inside House 15, Julian froze, his hand hovering over a stack of shirts. He heard it through the window.
Inside House 4, the Millers lifted their heads from their pillows, their eyes wide in the dark, listening. Inside House 1, Judge Thorne lowered his glass, his head cocking to the side, the instincts of a hunter alerting him to a disturbance in the environment. It was a cell phone. Someone had left a phone on the dinner table in their haste to flee.
It lay there, hidden, perhaps under a napkin or beside a wine glass, its screen lighting up, casting a small, pulsing blue glow against the white fabric of the tablecloth, a tiny heartbeat of light in the vast, overwhelming darkness of the lot. Ring, ring, ring. The sound echoed off the facades of the silent houses, a lonely, persistent plea for attention. Who would be calling at this hour?
Who would be calling a phone abandoned at a disastrous dinner party in the middle of a neighborhood imploding under the weight of its own secrets? Martha heard it too. She sat up in her kitchen, her head turning toward the window. She knew every phone ringtone of every resident. She had cataloged them, matched them to profiles. But this ringtone was generic, standard, the default sound of a burner phone or a device fresh out of the box. It was not a ringtone that belonged to Julian or the Millers or the Chens. It was a stranger's ring. She stood up, her joints popping, and walked slowly to the kitchen window, parting the blinds with a single finger to peer out into the night. She saw the tiny blue light pulsing on the table in the lot across the street. Ring, ring. The ringing continued, insistent, demanding, refusing to go to voicemail.
It was a summons.
And then, as the neighbors lay in their beds or stood in their darkened rooms, listening to the phone ring in the empty night, a second sound joined the first. It was the sound of a latch clicking, metal sliding against metal, heavy, lubricated, precise. It did not come from the vacant lot. It came from House 6. House 6, the empty house. The house that had been for sale for 2 years.
The house that Martha had used as the pretext for the dinner, the phantom limb of the neighborhood. The house that was supposed to be vacant, devoid of life, a hollow shell of drywall and subflooring, waiting for a family that never arrived. The front door of House 6, which had been locked and bolted, which had a for sale sign leaning crookedly against the railing, began to open.
It moved inward slowly, inch by inch, revealing nothing but a deeper, denser darkness inside the foyer, a blackness that seemed to spill out onto the porch like ink. The phone on the table continued to ring. The door of House 6 stood fully open now, a gaping mouth in the face of the building. No one stepped out. No light turned on inside. There was no movement, no silhouette, no figure emerging to answer the phone or to investigate the noise.
There was only the open door, inviting the night in, or perhaps letting something out. Julian, watching from his upstairs window, felt the blood drain from his face. He dropped the shirt he was holding. He knew, with a sudden, terrifying clarity, that Martha's surveillance system, her cameras and her microphones, had been focused outward, on the street, on the neighbors.
But he had never asked, and she had never said if she had put cameras inside the empty houses. He had never asked if she was the only one watching. The phone on the table stopped ringing. The silence that rushed back in was deafening, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the lungs of everyone listening. The blue light on the table faded, leaving the lot in darkness once more. But the door to House 6 remained open.
And then, from the depths of that open door, from the darkness of the empty house, came a sound that froze the blood in Martha Higgins's veins as she stood in her kitchen across the street. It was the sound of a landline phone ringing inside the empty house. It was a heavy, mechanical ring, the sound of an old rotary phone, a sound from a different decade, muffled by the walls, but distinct enough to carry across the quiet street. Brr-ing.
Brr-ing. It was answering the call that had just ended on the table. Martha backed away from the window, her hand covering her mouth. The logic of her world, the controlled environment she had curated, was fracturing. She had the keys to House 6. She had checked it yesterday. There was no phone line connected. There was no electricity. It was a dead zone. Brrr-ing. The sound was coming from the basement of House 6.
Judge Thorne, watching from his study, saw the open door. He saw the darkness. He reached into his desk drawer, his hand bypassing the legal pads and the pens, his fingers wrapping around the cold, textured grip of a revolver he hadn't fired in 20 years. He did not know what was happening, but he knew that the social contract was gone, replaced by a primal state of siege. He stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, and moved toward his front door. He told himself he was going to investigate, to restore order, but deep down, in the reptilian part of his brain that governs survival, he knew he was walking into a trap that had been set long before Martha Higgins ever bought a camera. He opened his front door and stepped out onto the porch. The air was freezing.
"Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding thin and weak in the vastness of the night. "Is anyone there?" The ringing in House 6 stopped. Thorne stood on his porch, the gun heavy in his hand, waiting for a response. He looked at House 2. The blinds were closed. Martha was gone from the window. He looked at House 15. A curtain twitched and fell still.
He looked at the open door of House 6.
"This is Judge Thorne," he announced, trying to summon the authority of the bench. "Identify yourself." For a long moment, there was nothing. Just the wind. Just the settling of the houses. And then, a voice drifted out from the open door of House 6. It was not a shout. It was not a whisper.
It was a recording played at high volume, amplified by speakers that must have been hidden in the foyer, the audio quality grainy and distorted, but unmistakably clear. It was Martha's voice. But it wasn't Martha speaking now. It was a recording of Martha speaking from years ago, perhaps decades. Her voice sounded younger, sharper, less burdened by the weight of her vigil.
"The experiment," the voice said, echoing off the siding of the houses, "is proceeding according to schedule. The subjects are responding to the pressure. Phase 1 is complete." Thorne took a step back, his heel hitting the doorframe. "Phase 2, the recording continued, flat and clinical, requires total isolation. Sever the connections. Initiate the blackout protocol." The recording cut off with a sharp burst of static.
And then, simultaneously, in a synchronized event that could only have been orchestrated by a central system far more sophisticated than Martha's kitchen setup, every remaining streetlight on Willow Lane went out. The darkness was absolute. Thorne couldn't see his hand in front of his face. He couldn't see the street. He couldn't see the vacant lot. But he could hear.